Thank you for having me here today. I'd sort of been hearing murmurings of this program for a while, and watching it sort of grow. And I think it's a really fantastic thing that we have happening, because it gives us all an opportunity to, first of all, recognize ourselves as a community, but also as a community that's just not local, but has a global kind of idea too. So I think that's a lot of fun, but also really important. And when we get to the specific issue of this month, I think it's a really, for me, a passionate theme that drives a lot of passion for me. And I do see we are still stretched, but we'll just deal with that. Try to, maybe if you like, squeeze your eyeballs, it'll stretch it out the right way or something. Yeah, this kind of stuff just drives me crazy, so I'm just going to try not to look at that, because on my screen it looks fantastic. But I do think this is a really important theme, and it's one that I think is actually extremely foundational to our general outlook globally, and not just design. I think that this touches basically everything. And why I say that is because even the fact that we have this slide says something. And we're showing arts and technology as two separate things that have an overlap that somehow, that in itself should be interesting. It's like, why wouldn't they have an overlap? And then we're calling out that overlap as something that we're describing as magic. And so really it starts to beg some questions. One of them is this, like, why are they separate to begin with? And for me, this is the reality that we all face, every single one of us on the planet, no matter what you do. And I truly believe that this is actually a foundational problem that is responsible for many of the issues that we're dealing with as a global population. And I mean it. I mean, I think global warming could be, you could argue that that's a cause of that split. I think just environmental degradation generally is a result of that split. When we hear about people not able to cope with life itself in China on assembly lines, I believe that that's a result of that split. When we talk about urban slums, I think that this is a result of that split. And when we talk about the financial collapse, I mean, I think this is the most direct link, but I truly believe that it's as a result of this split. And so I also think there's a hopeful side of this that we'll get to. That's where this is all going to go. But I think it is useful to think, to sort of take a step back and say, how did this happen? And I think it is a pretty recent thing that happened. I think it's in the last 100 years, starting more or less with the Industrial Revolution, where suddenly we had this ability to make things at scale, and we could distribute them at scale, and that it meant a whole different approach to how we shape our world. And so we started to get into what we called management science. We invented the MBA program, which was all about applying scientific thinking to these businesses and to more generally, society at large. It became about organizing ourselves and subcategorizing and really applying scientific method to our world, which was all about division and subdivision. I've been sort of fascinated with the idea of taking a study to say, if you were to look at the University of, Cambridge University, the first university that existed, and then look at the modern Cambridge, if you looked at the number of degree programs between now and then now you'd see an exponential explosion. It's because it's all about subdivision. And for me, I think the result of that has been this. We tend to think now in terms of columns and rows. And I mean this in a very broad sense. I think actually designers in this room are probably not so much inclined, but I do believe that as a society, again, this is the sort of place we've ended up. And it's really not a surprise this is where we are when we think about what we know about the brain. And what we do know about the brain, and a lot of this stuff is emerging quite recently, is that there are really two parts. There's the front part of the brain, which is the sort of more highly evolved, rational part of the brain, which really is the columns and rows part. And then there's the back part of the brain, which is more where intuition lies, instinct, our sort of ability to respond to things more emotionally. And I think that it's really important to understand this. I mean, it's really important to pause on this for a second, because we all have these little things in our pockets that are really powerful tools. We have this thing in our heads that's our own hardware. It's our own iPhone, so to speak, and it's 10,000 years old. It hasn't changed a whole lot in that time, and we're asking it to do a whole lot in a really dramatically changing context. As a little anecdote, it's been proven that this front part of the brain is only able to handle 7 numbers at any given time. That's the power of the front part of the brain. So it's pretty limited when you think about the complexity we deal with. And I think Einstein actually, to go back, as a pioneer and someone who saw things coming, really nailed it when he had this quote, where the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. I agree with this point of view that we now live in a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. And I really believe this, and I think that this is sort of a core to a lot of the challenges that we face. The other big issue is that, knowing we've got this 10,000-year-old piece of hardware and we live in this society, the problem is that things are really changing very, very quickly. I mean, if you look at, Wired just released its 20th year anniversary, and they've just launched their first edition on iPad again, and you can see this great quote from Marshall McLuhan, the famous Torontonian, who talks about how absolutely everything we're aware of, everything around us is changing, and not just changing, it's changing exponentially quickly. We're talking about 800 million users on Facebook, which is just a mind-numbing number. You can't comprehend what that number looks like. And so, here we are with these kind of old tools living in a very new world. But I think what's really cool about this is that because we live in this really diverse, multifaceted, incredible world, there's also things within it that are providing some clues into what the answers to our problems might be. Now, there's this guy. His name is Daniel Tammet. He's a British, he's about in his early 30s, and he has a condition called high-functioning Asperger's. And so basically he's a savant. He can crunch these numbers like Rain Man, and it's just incredible. He can recite pi up to 22,000 digits from memory. But what's really fascinating about this guy is that he's able to describe his own mental process. Most savants can't do it. They just don't have the tools to communicate with one another or with others. This guy can actually tell you what he's seeing, and what he says is that in his mind he sees images for each of the first 10,000 positive integers. So for every number from 1 to 10,000, he doesn't see a number, it's not an abstract idea, he sees a shape and a color and a texture. And so he drew pi to 19 digits, and this is what he sees when he sees pi. And so it's beautiful. And not only is it beautiful, but it's fascinating because the science is showing that what's happening in his brain is that most brains work in isolation. The different parts of the brain fire in different times, and they aren't really connected. What's unique about his brain is that all the pieces of his brain are actually interconnecting much more fluidly. So the downside is that he has a very hard time focusing. He can't drive a car because he's overwhelmed by the detail around him. He just soaks it all in. But the upside is that he shows us a whole other way of interpreting knowledge that's really fascinating. And I think that that's actually, when we see that, we tend to describe it as magic, and I think that that's actually, it's a way of looking at it, but I think what's really underneath this is it's not magic at all, it's actually design. And so I'll get into a little bit, very briefly, about why I believe that this is the case. But for me, if we talk about arts and technology, I think that those are the two parts of design, but the design is in fact the technology of art. And so what do we mean by that? Well, I personally think that this is the definition. It's a working definition. It's a fluid definition because, in fact, we are designers. We like to live in a fluid world. But this is really the synthesis of the definition of art and the definition of technology with a little thing added at the end. And so design is the application of scientific knowledge, creative skill, and imagination for practical purposes. And the piece that I've added is in service of better outcomes. And so for me, there's sort of the technical side of this, which is how we think, how we operate, how we produce things that we make as designers. But the exciting part is when we focus it on something, when we actually give it a purpose. Because you can design anything, but if you do it with purpose, then I think that's when we start to get into something very interesting, and that's when we start to see a solution to all the questions and the challenges that we face today. And so I do think that this is it. I think that the intersection of arts and design, when we produce great design, I often think it's described as magic. When you get into a boardroom of people who think in terms of columns and rows, let's say, they wonder, how did you do this? How did you come up with this? And it truly feels like magic. And so I actually think it's not magic at all, and I think that we all know that because we deal with it every day. And I think it can be a painful process. I think there is a bit of intuition at play, and I think, in fact, there's a lot of intuition in play. It's something that we really have to focus on as designers, because I think that we also are a function of this world, which is one of highly rational, highly systematic thinking. If we can figure out a way to bring more of that intuitive process into our own system of production, then that's when I think the really exciting opportunities start to emerge. So in a lot of ways, I think that design, in fact, is the sort of structured management of creative or intuitive thinking. So if we talk about, I sort of have three, let's say, big ideas here that there's lots of different ways of getting into design, and we could really go on for hours on how the process of design sort of unfolds. But I think for me there are three big principles that we could sort of focus on. And the first one is this one, the idea of starting with desire. I think this is a key dimension of design. Most processes, if you're following a more logical, linear process, say, okay, where's the insight? What's the audience? What's the key performance indicator? What's all this sort of stuff? Especially when you get into the business world, into a sort of MBA-educated process, it's a very linear, structured process that doesn't have a whole lot of room for things like beauty, intuition, magic. What I think design should do is actually kind of bridge that gap, and the first thing to do in that process is to start with a desire. So don't start with kind of the local immediate thing around you. Start with the vision of where you want to go. And that, I think, is most likely to get you to a better outcome, because it sets the ambition at the outset and lets you kind of build to that place in a way that gets rid of things like feasibility and viability. Will it work? Can we afford it? Those things, frankly, are sidetracks when you're that early in the process. And so the idea is to start with desire. Now, an example of that is the iPad. I mean, Steve Jobs himself said that he never could have market tested or done consumer research to get to this. It just couldn't have happened because no one had any concept of what an iPad was. And so for him, the idea of starting with desire is to say, I want to start with what the thing that people will want is, and then we will design toward that and then test that along the way in multiple iterations so we keep improving the experience. So the second point then is this idea of designing the experience itself. And so once you've got that iPad, I mean, it's integral to that process to say, what do I do? And I think that design often gets tripped up by thinking very locally about what is the physical object and what does it look like, what's the shape, what's the material, all those sorts of things. When it gets really exciting is when we start to think about what's the kind of start to finish and go further upstream and further downstream. And so, for example, working on a stadium we did in New York, we talked about the street-to-seat experience. And so what is everything that the user or the human being experiences from the moment they are standing on the street with their ticket to the minute they're sitting in their seat? And that's a different way of thinking. It's not a conventional way of thinking, but it really leads you to different places because you're actually considering all the facets. I think a really good example of that is a project that we actually helped with in Fogo Island in Newfoundland called the Fogo Island. Well, the Shorefast Foundation is the foundation, but really it's a project that is all about this very thing we're talking about, this idea of sort of embracing art, bringing it forward, and allowing it to be sort of a source of renewal. So the story with this project is that a brother and sister grew up on Fogo Island. It's a population of 6,000 people in the 60s. It dramatically dropped throughout the past 20, 30 years to a population now of 3,000 people because the fishery dried up. And a woman named Zita Cobb and her brother Tony Cobb grew up there, and they grew up in the 60s in Newfoundland with not even, forget about television, but not even a radio. And their sort of big moment was when their father returned from a logging expedition or a logging trip with a radio. And that was the first time they'd ever seen a world outside of the world that they were used to, and that's what opened them up to the possibilities that were beyond Fogo and led Zita and Tony to both go and get education. Zita became the third highest paid female executive in North America, and then retired at the height of the dot-com boom, made a ton of money, sailed the world, and decided, what, my real place here is to come back to Fogo because there's something so special here. I mean, she was living in the world that we're describing as the world of Microsoft Excel, and she said, there's so much more to this experience than columns and rows. And so she started this new thing on Fogo Island, which is about artisan residency programs. She's brought this amazing architect from Newfoundland called Todd Saunders to design the architecture. There's going to be an inn opening next year. The arts program is also supported by a variety of other resources in the community. And even so far as they've started a boat competition, a rowboat competition, they're called Dories, where they're trying to rekindle the art of boat making in Newfoundland. And so they've created this race across the open ocean to get people to participate, but also by virtue of their participation, they have to make boats, and so it's rekindling an old practice. And so for her, she also deeply believes that art, this intersection of art and technology, is what's going to get us to the next place, which is one of a sort of a sustainable way of living on this planet. So the final thought is this idea of think by doing. What this means really is that, again, if we follow the linear model, we put strategy, and then we go into some research, and then we do design, and design has kind of a point downstream. That's a way of doing things, and it's not that it's invalid. I'm not here to say that Microsoft Excel does not have a place, because it absolutely has a critical place. It keeps us organized. But what I am saying is that there is an alternate way of thinking about things that's a little more integrated. And so thinking by doing means that you can actually develop strategy by producing design. And so by making tangible things, you're actually able to accelerate the thinking. And so when you sit down and design a logo, a building, a space, a website, anything, we naturally as designers tend to produce things in order to think through them. And so that's a skill that we don't recognize as being quite valuable. It's actually a very rare thing in business for people to think that way. They tend to think in words first, try to get to a point where it makes sense, and then build it out. When we all know that you cannot figure some things out with words, you have to draw it. And so that's a really critical part of the process for us. And so we recently, we're working with, on the one hand, we work with small social entrepreneurships in Newfoundland. We're also working with big multinational corporations like Unilever. And they have a really fantastic sustainability plan, which is recognized by sustainability experts as global, world-leading, and really game-changing. And so we're working with them now on their identity system, but we're also working with them on a variety of other initiatives, one of which is a thing that they call Waterworks. And so Waterworks is a project that they're working on with Facebook, and the idea is that, unlike traditional philanthropy, Unilever tries to spend money but also create programs to support the local situation that they're sort of working in. And so with Waterworks, what they're doing is they're bringing a water filtration system and distributing it to communities in need where there's lack of clean water. And so a part of that is to try to leverage or connect people like us who are living in pretty great conditions to people in parts of the world that don't have the access or the benefit of access to clean drinking water. And so this program called Waterworks, I'll play a video for you that shows what the idea is. But really the point is that they didn't write a strategy first and come up with, work it all out and then say, okay, this is ready to now move into design. Design became an integral part of figuring out the process. It wasn't just again, sort of a linear thing. It was, okay, let's design the experience, design the platform, iterate, refine it, learn, new iteration, learn. I mean, we all know this, but for me, it's quite heartening to see that some organizations are starting to work in this way more explicitly, and I think that it leads to some really great results. So I'll just play this video now.
Water is the source of life. We all need it. Yet almost 800 million people, more than 1/10 of the world's population, don't have access to clean drinking water. Half of the world's hospital beds are filled with people suffering from waterborne diseases such as dysentery and cholera. A child dies every 20 seconds from water-related illness. We have made an ambitious commitment to this issue through the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan to provide safe drinking water to 500 million people by 2020.
So I think for me, the thing that's exciting about this is I do think there are signs of change. I started with some pretty bleak slides, but I do think that, first of all, the thing that's scary, all that kind of complexity and all that, those numbers that seem overwhelming are actually also the solution. And so whether you're a big corporation or a small social entrepreneurship, we are seeing signs that people are trying to do something. And to me, what design can offer in the end is this idea of holistic thinking. We don't think in columns and rows. We think about, first of all, the entire spreadsheet, but also what's beyond the edges of the spreadsheet. And so for me, that's the kind of key thing for us to focus on, is try to encourage more holistic thinking, because when you do that, you start to understand how things are interconnected. And when we start to think about things in interconnected ways, we realize that every action that we take has an impact somewhere else, and we can start to consider the whole system. So that's what I got to say.